We know some people want our ideas to seem impossible. Ideas like a fairer tax system or reining in the gas industry or transparency in politics. And yet time and time again the Australia Institute has succeeded in making politically impossible ideas seem inevitable. But we can't do it alone. If you love dollars and cents, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution in our end of financial year appeal. Even better, thanks to 4 generous donors, every dollar donated until June 30 will be matched, dollar for dollar, until we reach our goal. So you'll double your impact if you make a donation at australiainstitute.org.au today. I hope you enjoyed today's show.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we explain just what the hell is going on in the economy. My name is Greg Jericho. I'm the Chief Economist at the Australian Institute, and joining me, as always, is our podcast producer, Jennifer Macy. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Greg. So, yeah, I know. First of all, I have to apologise for sounding so terrible. It's my turn to catch the winter lurgy.
But here at Dollars and Cents, we just power on through to keep delivering great content.
I can still ask questions, so. But this week we've got something really special. We've had a bunch of listeners write in with questions for you, Greg. And so I'm going to read out a few, and then we can get to your Guardian article, Grogonomics, which is what we base our episodes on each week.
Yep.
So Robert Garbett, I hope I've got that pronunciation correct, has written in with lots of questions. We might just stick to a few, but he asks, isn't a surplus in the current economic climate a good thing? Or doesn't it really matter if there's a surplus or a deficit? I feel like that's a good question, Greg, and something that lots of people might be thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a good question. Thanks to everyone who's put in some questions. We're going to try and do this a bit regularly where we can sort of every month or so really answer some questions, especially when I write an article that is a bit of a recap of things we've been doing. So yeah, budget surplus, because listeners will remember I kind of said before the budget, look, we obsess too much about surpluses and deficits. We shouldn't worry about such things. But it doesn't mean they're completely unimportant, but it means you really need to think about what's going on in the economy. When the economy is running hot, when there's a lot of demand, the private sector is going really well, that's kind of when you want the government to think about running a surplus, because surpluses, remember, what do? They take money out of the economy, because a surplus is the government raising more revenue than it is spending. So in a sense, whatever that surplus is, let's say it's a $5 billion surplus, that means the government has taken $5 billion out of the economy and has kept it in its coffers and isn't doing anything with it. If it's in a deficit, it means, like, let's say it's a $5 billion deficit, that means it spent $5 billion more than it took out of the economy, so it's adding to the economy. So that's a good way to think about it. Now, in the current economic climate, what have we got? Well, we do have high inflation, or at least inflation above where the Reserve Bank would like it. Now, you might think, oh, well, does that mean the economy's running hot and we should be running surpluses? Well, yes, if we were in a mining boom like we were in the 2000s, but as listeners will know from last week, GDP figures, terrible, economy not running hot, nearly going backwards. That's a sign that really running a surplus, maybe not a great thing at this time. And so, what the government's doing for this financial year and the next financial year, running deficits, probably the smarter thing to do, but also think about it. They're not big, they're not small deficits or surpluses either way. It pretty much is a bit of a neutral setting at the moment. It's not like there's a massive amount of stimulus out there or a massive amount of austerity either way. So it does matter. And I think what the government's doing at the moment is probably about right, but it's not too bad one way or the other.
But if the government pumps too much money into the economy, doesn't that also increase the risk of raising inflation?
Yeah, it does, which is why at the moment, as I say, the deficit is not that huge. It's really not what I would think is pumping too much money in the economy. That's why there is a delicate balance at the moment, because they want to keep inflation down, but also the economy is slow. So it's a case of which poison do you want to take, really? Do you want the high inflation, or do you want an economy that is slowing so fast, or slowing so greatly that there's a risk that unemployment will start going up? So what the government has done with the energy supplement, there's really, it's not enough to fuel inflation. And also, as we've been saying for the past, for as long as we've been doing this podcast, the inflation that we're dealing with at the moment really isn't due to us going out there and spending lots of money. It's due to a lot of international factors, due to supply, due to what companies are doing. And so the concerns about pumping up inflation, I think, are massively overblown.
Okay, so Robert's next question also relates to us going out and spending money. And it's where you talked about the relationship between inflation and wages growth. And you said we're only able to buy the same amount of stuff that we could buy in 2010. And so Robert wants to know, if we were happy with that amount of stuff in 2010, why would we want to buy more? Can you explain kind of the maths behind that?
Yeah, again, really good question, because there's this belief that, why are we always wanting to buy more stuff? It's not so much about buying more stuff. It's about your living standards. Your ability to buy more stuff is, in a sense, saying you're actually able to spend more money. Your wage has more power than it did a year ago, did 10 years ago. And that's essentially living standards. You might think, okay, 2010 was really good, so I was happy there. Okay, were you happy in 1990? Should have living standards stopped then? Or what about 1980, 1970? The reality is we want our living standards to keep going up. And the reason why is because actually we're working for that. Because the reason that living standards is able to go up is because our productivity is improving. We're actually making more things. We're doing more things with our time. We deserve to get rewarded for that. And I can tell you, there are only, in a sense, two people or two sides of a coin that can actually benefit from productivity growth: the workers or the companies and the businesses. And if our living standards don't go up, even though our productivity is improving, that I could tell you company profits are going up. So you can say, okay, I was happy in 2010. Yeah, but I think you deserve to get a bit of a pay rise that is better than inflation. And that's essentially what we're talking about. And what we're really talking about here when we're saying going back to 2010 is because the last 3 years we've seen inflation rise so much faster than our wages that it's not so much we're back at 2010, it's that our living standards have, in a sense, fallen about 5% since 2020. So you might have been happy in 2010. Were you happy in 2020? Probably. But you're now 5% sort of back from there. So it's a good indicator of our overall well-being, and also it's a good indicator of who's actually benefiting from productivity.
Okay, that makes sense. And this is a question I also want to know. So Robert's got one more. He says, if we're worried about climate change and other environmental stressors, isn't pegging growth okay? And Greg, for the sake of the environment, shouldn't we limit economic growth at some point?
Look, this is one that often comes up, and it's something that, I don't really care too much about GDP growth itself. When we talk about growth and, we need to maintain a certain... I don't really care about that. I do care about who is benefiting from income growth overall, because I think actually workers and households should do better off the profits. But when we're talking about growth and the concern about climate change, the issue really isn't that we should peg growth, we should stop growing. The issue is that our growth should become much less dependent on fossil fuels. If we can actually achieve the same amount of growth without actually expelling fossil fuels in the air, then that seems pretty good to me. And the problem I have with this view that, for the good of the climate, we need to peg growth, is it really feeds into those fear campaigns by climate change deniers that, you're basically saying you want us to go back to the 19th century or something. It's like, no, we need to electrify everything. We need to get off of using gas. We need to think about, using renewable electricity rather than, fossil fuels. And so that's what the key is. Now, that might mean that overall growth is more or less than in the past. I'm not too worried about that. The big thing is decoupling our economy from fossil fuel growth. And we certainly have seen over the past 30 years, even though our emissions haven't exactly gone down, our dependence on fossil fuels as a sort of percent of our GDP actually has. So it is possible, but obviously we've got to do a lot more. And so that's really the key thing.
And a lot faster. All right, next up is Tony Walker, and it's more of a statement than a question, but I'll read it out. Productivity will never improve while the quality of management is poor and the training and development of staff, especially in the information age, is neglected. When spokespeople for key industry groups on 200,000 realise that productivity will be enhanced by good HR practices for those on award wages or less, we might see increases in returns and thus productivity across the economy. Tony seems to be talking about upskilling staff, but what does actually increase productivity?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Tony, because we often hear about productivity. Oh, we got to change IR laws. We got to have more flexibility and things like that. But really, what does improve productivity? Investment in new technology, investment in new equipment, investment in new IT. Also, education, having a more educated workforce so you're actually able to do things better, smarter. You know, the old dopey line of work smarter, not harder. That's essentially what productivity is about. And it's not a thing that really comes about, I got to say, from changes to IR or things like that. It actually comes a lot from management, from businesses actually investing in this new equipment, new ways of doing things. And that's why I always push back on the sense that workers are to blame for low productivity or things like that. I mean, we don't go to work and decide, oh, I'm going to work more productive today or less productive today. You kind of work as productive as you usually do. Productivity growth comes from, oh, we've actually got some new equipment, or we've got some better tools here I can use, or you know, we've invested in better computer, so we're not sitting around waiting for our computer to load all the time. That things actually work quickly now, or you know, it's a lot of things done by industry, done by the management, done by companies. But at the end of the day, it's the workers who actually have to do that and who have to actually produce the output, and they should get the benefit from it. But Tony's point is really well made, that actually quality of management is actually a key thing. And if productivity is down, there's far too little shade, I think, put on how bad perhaps our managers are in Australia, our CEO, and whether or not they're really up to scratch. Instead, it's like, oh, workers in Australia are overpaid. And it's like, well, is it that, or is it our managers perhaps, or our CEOs of companies are perhaps overpaid, or perhaps they're underperforming?
Next up, Samuel White writes about the RBA's target level of unemployment and what they refer to as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, otherwise known as NAIRU. So Samuel was wondering if the RBA may be looking at shifting away from this NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, and how do other central banks around the world deal with or measure employment rates?
Yeah, another good question, Samuel. I mean, the NAIRU, for those, just a quick recap, it's that level of unemployment at which inflation is not going up or down, especially it's not going up, it's not accelerating. You could actually say it's a bit tricky because, as we know, for the past sort of year or so, inflation has actually been decelerating, which would suggest that we're actually maybe above that unemployment rate where inflation is rising, but actually the Reserve Bank thinks we're still below it. It's a kind of a weird sort of thing. The problem with the NAIRU is it's a hypothetical concept. You can't really say precisely where it is or isn't, and it moves up and down, and we think it's actually a bit of a pointless sort of target because, you know, back in the 80s, the NAIRU might have been about 6%. Now it's certainly probably below 4.5%. It goes up and down. I don't think the Reserve Bank has moved away from it, unfortunately. What I do think is they might have revised down what they think the NAIRU is. A year or so ago, they were thinking it was around 4.5. Now I reckon they think it's about 4.3, maybe, because that seems to be where they're targeting to get unemployment over the next year or so. Other nations, again, will have different targets. Canada's, for example, would be probably higher because historically their unemployment has been higher. The real key thing is what's their inflation target. And for example, again, to stay with Canada, their target range for inflation is between 1% and 3%. So they kind of aim for 2%. Our inflation target is between 2% and 3%. So we kind of aim for 2.5%. You know, it's just, we've decided for our economy 2.5% seems to be a good place to aim. For theirs, they reckon 2%. There's no, you know, they try to squint and say there is a lot of economics behind this, but not really. I wish the Reserve Bank was moving away from the Nauru. We had the employment white paper last year, which really kind of gave the Nauru a bit of a slapping and said, we really should be just trying to keep unemployment as low as possible, and that full employment is something that is outside of the Nauru. It's something where basically everyone who wants to get a job can get a job in a fairly short time, which is not linked with inflation or anything like that. The Reserve Bank, unfortunately, they think inflation is critical to the Nauru. One of the interesting things about the Reserve Bank in the past few months, they have put out how they kind of target full employment, and they've got a whole range of measures, including underemployment, underutilization, hours worked, the vacancy rate, how many job vacancies are there, and a whole range of things. And they've kind of got, these measures that they're looking to see whether we're up above it or below it, and sort of doing a bit of it looks on balance that we're at full employment. So they've kind of shifted, but not too much, I'd say.
Okay, great.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you all. Send them, as always, to our email, which is podcast, and that's podcast plural S, at australiainstitute.org.au. So podcast at australiainstitute.org.au. Really keep them coming. They're great.
So, Greg, most of these questions related to inflation, as does your article this week, and you're right that a lot of the commentary is becoming quite unhinged. Now, Greg, that's not a very nice way to talk about your fellow economists.
Yeah, I mean, the unhingedness really relates to the fact that we saw last week a couple of central banks, namely Canada and the European Central Bank, cut interest rates.
Well, interest rates are starting to come down overseas, but not here just yet.
Overnight, Canada became the second major Western economy after Sweden to cut interest rates in the face of falling inflation.
The European Central Bank cut rates for the first time in 5 years, lowering its key deposit rate by a quarter percentage point to 3.75%.
It means Australia seems to be lagging behind other economies that have crushed inflation more quickly.
And The Economist has declared that Australia has the most persistent inflation of any advanced country in the world. Inflation remains stubborn because our policy settings are not right.
And there was this, they're cutting interest rates. Why aren't we cutting interest rates in Australia? Obviously, it's because our inflation's too high. The Reserve Bank was too weak. They should have raised interest rates even a lot more. And I was basically like, well, steady on, guys. Let's have a look at the whole economy, not just inflation.
Why did they cut interest rates?
I mean, basically, the reason they're cutting interest rates is because, their inflation is now below 3%. But the reality is, they're about 6 months ahead of where we were. They reached their peak of inflation, which was around 8%, pretty much right on line with our peak, but they reached it in around June, July 2022. We reached our peak in December 2022. We went up at roughly the same pace. We're going down at roughly the same pace. They're just 6 months ahead, and you kind of look at where people were expecting us to be in 6 months, and that's when you're starting to see predictions for rate cuts. They were able to cut rates because their inflation's down, but also you look at their economy and they kind of needed to cut rates because when you look at other things, we're doing a lot better than they are.
So let's have a look at one of those indicators or one of those figures, and that's unemployment rates. So how do we compare to Canada and Europe when it comes to unemployment?
Yeah, this is a key thing because when you just focus on inflation, think, all we got to do is get inflation down. It's like, okay, well, that's nice. But is that what we only care about? And if you were to say Canada's inflation is below 3% and ours is above 3%, therefore Canada's economy is doing a lot better, it's like, okay, our unemployment in April was 4.1%. Canada's unemployment is 6.2%. Now, which would you prefer? Which one sounds like a better economy? And here's the other thing. Inflation started rising in around the first 3 months of 2022 across the world. That's when it started going up. Since then, our unemployment has risen about 0.1%. It's gone from about 4 to 4.1. In the meantime, it went down, went up, but basically over that time, it's gone up about 0.1%. Not much change. Canada's has gone up 0.7%. So not only is their unemployment rate high, it's also gone up faster than ours has. So in effect, their economy, their labour force is a bit weaker than ours. And when you've got a weak labour force and you've got high unemployment, what do you do if you're a central bank? Well, you cut rates because that helps speed up the economy. So that's another reason why they are going to cut rates more than us. But here's the other thing. Canada has cut their interest rate. Great. You might think, oh, that's fantastic. Lucky Canadians. They're actually now getting interest rate relief. Their cash rate, in a sense, their equivalent official rate, went from 5% to 4.75%. Now, Australia's is 4.35%. So ours is still lower. It's like, okay, they've cut their interest rates from something that was higher than ours to something that's still higher than ours. I don't think that's an example of a great win by the Canadian Central Bank that they're doing so much better than us. It's like, well, they've still got higher interest rates than us. I mean, great. They're getting to cut rates sooner, but get back to me when they're below where we are. That might be something where then you start to actually be able to crow about it. So, I kind of looked at it and was like, really? Let's have a look at the overall economy, and especially, as I always say, the economy is people. Let's look at actually how workers are doing. And to be honest, I'd probably rather be in Australia, certainly if I wanted to get a job.
But there is one thing that they are faring better than Australia on at least one measure, and that's wages.
Yeah, they're getting really strong wages growth. They're getting wages growth above 5%.
Right.
And we're getting it around 4.1%. It's probably going to start going down below that. One of the interesting things about that, though, is it really highlights, okay, they've got stronger wage growth than us, but they've got lower inflation growth. That seems to me to suggest that maybe there's not actually that big of a link between wages and inflation like we always hear, in the papers here. Oh, we got to watch out for a wage price inflation. We got to watch out, make sure, keep wages down. It's like, well, hang on. These same conservative newspapers are looking at Canada going, oh, Canada's doing so much better. They've got inflation down. It's like, okay, are you going to now start saying that if we got wage growth above 5%, that'd be okay? I doubt it. So they're kind of cherry picking the data that they want to suggest that Canada's doing better than us or their central bank has been better than ours. It's all a bit silly. And especially when you look at another reason why they've been able to cut rates and why they had to raise rates higher than us isn't because their central bank was tougher and more engaged. It's they have to raise interest rates more to have an impact because more of their mortgage holders have a fixed rate mortgage, so an interest rate doesn't affect them. Whereas in Canada, about 35% of people have a variable mortgage. In Australia, it is 85%. In the UK, only 15% have a variable mortgage. In the US, only 5%. I've noted this in the past when we talked about who's got hurt most by interest rate rises. Australia gets hurt more by interest rate rises than any other country. So that means that the Reserve Bank doesn't need to raise rates as hard as other countries because rate rises here hurt more than rate rises do elsewhere. So if we were to have raised interest rates to 5% like the Canadians did, we're basically just arguing, oh, we want to hurt people more here for no real good reason.
So does that mean that if they cut interest rates, it doesn't have the same economic effect that it would here either?
Yeah, it's the same, goes both ways. Interest rate rises hurt more here, hurt less in Canada, have less power in Canada, and that means rate cuts have less power there. Now, rate cuts, I always argue rate cuts have less power than a rate rise, but also it does show that, if you've got a lot of people with fixed rate mortgages whose interest rate repayments aren't going to change by interest rate cuts, it means you've got a bit more leeway to cut an interest rate and not worry about, oh, that's going to fuel inflation. But as I say, that also means when you're trying to slow inflation, you have to raise them by more than we do here in Australia. So, there's swings and roundabouts, but it's this sense of looking at what's happening in Canada, looking at what's happening in America or even Europe, and just going, oh, look at their interest rates are going down or up or whatever, and just thinking that's the only thing we need to worry about. I'm like, there's a hell of a lot more going on in the economy than just that. Let's step back a bit.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Greg.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all those who contributed questions. Please keep them coming in, because the more come in, the more often we can really have one of these episodes where we answer them. They really help us think about the topics that we're going to cover as well. So please keep coming with the feedback. Also, if you leave comments on the podcast that you listen to, really helpful. Give us a 5-star rating as well. Hey, why not? But otherwise, thank you everyone for listening. We will be back next week with another Dollars and Cents. This episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Thursday, the 13th of June, and was actually recorded before the May unemployment figures came out. So some things definitely will have changed. You can find my column, Grogonomics, which has a look at sort of how Canada and Australia and the US are all doing on interest rates, at the Guardian Australia site. And for more research on all range of topics related to economics, the climate, democracy, everything your hearts could desire and you need to know, at our website, which is at australiainstitute.org.au. My Twitter handle and the handle I use for all social media is at GrogScammer, and Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. And our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. See you all next week.